So Mike, another week, another episode done. I believe this is episode 31 or 32, so we're quite far into it now.
Yeah, absolutely. We've just gone past my own age in the number of podcasts that we've done. And yeah, I know it was a tough paper round, so we'll skim over that.
Such a young chap. Well, this week, guys, we have Natalie Barton, who is the Digital Communities and Marketing Officer for Propertymark.
Well said.
For those that, I got it out in one. For those that don't know Propertymark, they work closely with the government, helping guide with legislation and try and put policies in place to help those landlords out there, and just basically work with the government in order to make it fair for renters, landlords and the like. So Mike, moving on to the episode, we've almost got Natalie on the show, but what are you looking most excited for?
Yeah, as you say, Propertymark are the organising body that we're affiliated to, and we need to be, to look after agents and obviously make sure that landlords' interests and the letting industry's interests are represented properly. So looking forward to knowing what their opinion is, where they're looking to push the industry, what they're lobbying for, how indeed on earth you lobby for something to happen against the government or with the government, depending on which way it is, and frankly what she thinks of the property market from her unique perspective.
No, definitely I have to agree, and I think same views from myself, but we've seen it before with the tenant fee ban. Obviously it was quite a long transition before that come into effect, but they were obviously working with that. We've seen it with other legislation, and it'll be interesting to see what happens with the potential, or when it comes into effect, the abolition of the Section 21 notices, and what happens with everything else like lifetime deposits, strengthen the Section 8 notice. So I'm looking forward to find out from her mouth what's going on, where we stand with things. We've seen drafts online on the government website, but where we are with things basically. So let's get her on. Ready?
Let's do it.
So Natalie, thank you very much for joining us on this week's podcast.
Thank you very much for having me. Very exciting to be here.
No, really pleased to have you. And I think it's a good carry on to have, following from a recent podcast or 5-6 months ago with Megan. We know there's a lot changed in the last 6 months, a lot of press going out there. And we thought it was about time to have someone back really to talk about this and go into a bit more detail for those listeners out there, because there's a lot of important changes that people need to be aware of. And there are some changes that's happened since then, which hopefully we can go into more detail.
Brilliant stuff. I mean, that's the thing with government, isn't it? And being a landlord, you have to keep your ear constantly to the ground to know that you're meeting the right legislative requirements. Otherwise, you can end in a lot of trouble. So that is absolutely fundamental as a landlord. Yeah. Yeah,
definitely. And I think there's one thing that we normally ask our guests, and that's why they become a property professional themselves. So I just wondered if you could sort of share this with our listeners.
Yeah, no problem. So like a lot of people in property, I kind of fell into it. I was out for a jog. I was a mum, and they were advertising 4 hours every other week in a little an estate agents that in the town where I live. I never did do 4 hours every other week, because as soon as I started, I absolutely loved it. So I started in an estate agency with Fine and Country, and then we were based within an independent agency, and the letting side just was thriving and so busy and so interesting that when I got offered a position over with them, I moved over and I entered the world of lettings and never really looked back. So I was a letting agent for 7 years, became part of Propertymark as a regional executive, volunteering in my spare time, and the legislation and being part of that community really sort of fulfilled, that gave me so much within my role and added to my role, and gave me so much advice that I could offer to landlords. So I've since moved over, and I now work for Propertymark itself.
It's funny you say that you fell into it. The amount of times, I don't know if you hear the same, Mike, but the amount of people that say they fell into agency 10, 15
so,
years
I mean, I didn't
later.
so much, yeah, I didn't so much pivot. I pirouetted, because before that I was a dance teacher.
Oh, wow. Total change then.
Total change. But yeah, I wouldn't pirouette out of it now.
So getting stuck in then, when we last spoke to Megan, there was a lot of talk about potential changes happening. So in the last 6 months, is there any changes that landlords that are listening need to be aware of?
I mean, the changes really, I mean, obviously, we've had the Levelling Up white paper launched by government, and that kind of encompassed a lot of things that were being discussed already in the Renters Reform Bill. So it's kind of consolidating that within this wider programme that the government's got to improve standards in various aspects throughout the country, you know, looking nationally and looking locally as well. So although governments seem to have their eyes set on everybody becoming homeowners, there's still a very fundamental need to have a fair deal for renters as well. And that obviously impacts landlords and their decisions, as well as affecting tenants in their rights and everything too. So it's going to be a sort of the Levelling Up white paper and the Renters Reform Bill combined are going to have some seismic effects really throughout the private rented sector and beyond.
Okay, I mean, there's some big changes on that I've seen. There's drafts online which people have full access to, which we will post on the podcast as well for people to review. But just breaking it down for those that don't know what it is, can you just break down the key points of this and how it affects those landlords out there and potential tenants?
I mean, one of the most fundamental aspects that gets raised time and time again is the government's pledge to abolish Section 21 notices. Now, that's causing quite a lot of jitteriness amongst landlords, because things that landlords want are to know that they're going to make some income on their rental property, because after all, landlords aren't charities, it's an investment at the end of the day. And they want to know that should they need it, whether it's because of their tenants' behaviour or because of their own personal circumstances, that they can get their property back in their own possession when they should need it. Now, obviously, with Section 21's being no fault and being mandatory ground for eviction, it gives landlords assurances that they have that right to get their property back. If that's abolished, the jitteriness comes from not knowing what the new grounds will be. Now, the government said that they will tighten up Section 8 grounds, so it will just be a different way of getting your property back. And with delays in the court systems and you know, all the various implications of COVID that sort of had an effect on the courts, actually it could result in a better court process. If people get involved in the consultations, then we can make sure that it's kind of fit for purpose and actually has the result that we need. It doesn't have to be a bad thing, but at the moment, that uncertainty as to what it could look like, I think, is causing quite a lot of doubt for landlords and making them contemplate whether they want to retain their investment or whether it's time to sell.
So just with regards to the Section 8 notice then, obviously I mentioned there's drafts online with regards to this. Is there any clarity at this stage of what that will be? So is it if someone's moving back into the property or if they plan to sell?
I mean, I think fundamentally then we need to make sure, as people within the property industry, that there are those grounds that if a landlord, I mean, although tenants have their circumstances and they should have the right to have a secure tenancy, at the same time, landlords don't have a crystal ball, and they can be impacted by illness or family change of circumstances, change of jobs. There can be any need that, you know, you want to sell your investment to help your own children onto the housing ladder, or you want to sell your rental property because you're coming up for retirement, or you want to sell because there's been a death, you know, worst case scenario, isn't it, that the landlord's died and the family's left with the rental property with tenants in it. You know, there needs to be a way for landlords to be able to have their property back, you know, when they need it. So making sure those Section 8s are fit for purpose is going to be absolutely fundamental.
Yeah, definitely. I think we don't want lots of landlords that are stuck in circumstance, like you said, if there's a death or some sort of illness, they want to be in that position to be able to, if they have to. I understand why they're doing it, in my opinion. I think it's something needed to be done, whether it is that extreme or not. I think everyone's entitled to their opinion, but it'll be interesting to see what the final bill would be once that's finally out there.
Absolutely. And it'll be interesting to see as well, because I mean, landlords do not evict tenants for no reason. It just doesn't happen, because you're in there to invest in property, to make a profit. If you've got a good tenant and your own personal circumstances are good and you're in it for the long haul, then there's not an issue. Far more tenancies are ended by tenants' request than they are by landlords. So it needs to be kept into perspective as well, that if you are a landlord, the chances are that your tenancy will be ended because the tenant wants to move on. I mean, even though tenancies are becoming longer, I think the average now in the last private renter sector report from Propertymark from March was the average length of tenancy is 23 months.
Wow.
Which is quite impressive stuff. It's a good solid investment, but at the same time, within 2 years, you can't ever quite predict what's going to happen. So yeah, you do need that kind of certainty that worst case scenario, you can get your property back.
Natalie, what do you think brought about this whole hoo-ha about Section 21 notices? I mean, I've got my opinions, but it's been I guess something that's been gathering pace and gathering speed about Section 21 notices needing to be abolished. But what do you think actually caused that to gather pace?
It's a tricky one, isn't it? I think in some respects, although it says it's no fault, but tenants actually, if they're being asked to leave what is their home, it's kind of a sign of respect to be able to tell them why. You know, just, oh, I want you out just because I want you out, doesn't reflect a very fair deal for those tenants. If a landlord can go to a tenant and say, I'm really sorry, I need you to leave the property because, you know, I've got a long-term illness and I need the property back to live in, and, you know, and up front can actually say, at the end of the day, this might be the case that I'm going to need the property back for X, Y, or Z reasons, then at least the tenants go into those circumstances aware. And, you know, so it is a fairer deal for the tenants in that respect. And I don't think that necessarily making them aware of the circumstance behind the eviction notice is a bad thing. I'm not sure that they'll always necessarily like it all the same, like, oh, actually, I'm asking you to leave because you've damaged the property, or I'm asking you to leave because you've had, you know, multiple rent late payments and things like that. You know, is that really going to be any nicer or friendlier on the tenants? But at the same time, yeah, if that's what tenants want, and certain groups would say that that is, then, you know, as long as you can still get a property back, then perhaps that's fair enough. Again, there's never not a reason, so we might as well give them those reasons.
Yeah, absolutely. No one takes back a property without a motive, right?
No,
you know,
and most landlords will sort of, even if it's down to the tenants, will give them the benefit of the doubt for possibly months. You know, oh, you know, they're going through income difficulties, can't pay the rent. Well, you know, I'll you know, as we saw with COVID, you know, we'll make a payment plan. We'll give you some time in hand. So by the time actually a section notice comes, even if it's a tenant's situation, there's been a lot of sort of thought given into that, and, you know, it's not a decision that most landlords would take lightly.
Mm-hmm.
It'd be interesting to see what happens on that, especially with fewer properties on the market at the moment. Typically, I don't see many landlords giving notice for no reason.
No.
It goes back to our podcast with Megan, actually. You get out what you get in, and you said most tenants will leave because they want to leave rather than anything else. And if you look after your
well, you would hope, the tenants would hope, but at the moment, not even that's possible. You've got tenants who've got changing family circumstances, they've got another baby on the way or something, or have got a change of jobs, but they can't find the property because, you know, landlords have been driven from the market and are selling up, and you can't blame the landlords either, because that's been the best choice for them. So we need to incentivize landlords to invest in the market, and that will help the market overall, really. Landlords need to be prioritized too.
We released a podcast recently saying that in the last 5 years, 260,000 properties have left the market in the last 5 years, which is
It's
incredible.
crazy, isn't it?
And when we
And
asked
To
demand
Chris
just
Watkin for lifting that
yeah.
stat as well.
yeah,
And the demand keeps increasing as well. There's no expectation that even if people are encouraged into home ownership, that it is the best choice for them. So the demographics show that more and more tenants will come to the market, and so we need to have a sector that supports that too.
so I did have a question off the back of that then. So we are seeing lots of rental prices go up because of the sheer demand of people looking for property, but also the lack of stock. I've seen lots of articles about putting in some sort of rent restriction of some sorts, or rent cap. Do you see anything like this potentially coming into effect? And if it did, how would it work?
Oh, rent caps always seem like such a good idea from a superficial perspective if you are responsible for a community such as the local government or something. But I think time and time again, they've proved to be pretty devastating to the market. And I think, as Megan pointed out when she was on, that if you're going to incentivize people to invest, there's no point going, well, actually, you can only set this at so much, because it just drives people away. There are other options. So you're far, far better to say to people, well, actually, the market is the market, but we will have, if you've got sufficient property in it that meets the demand, then it comes down to supply and demand, doesn't it? And tenants then have a choice, and landlords have to adapt to the market rather than legislation in that way.
Yeah, I agree. I think rent caps just discourage people from putting money into their property as well.
Oh, yeah,
You
absolutely.
see a drowning quality of property, because if I can only rent my 2-bed flat between 800 and 1,000 a month, well, there's no point me putting new kitchen, new bathroom, new flooring in, because I'm never going to see my money back.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a very, very good point that, you get you get out what you put in, and tenants should expect the same in a way, isn't it? If you are paying a market price and you've got a choice, that's the landlord, isn't it? I need to offer the best because I need to attract somebody to my property, or I need to, make it a decent standard. That should set the pace just as much as kind of the housing standards legislation should. Housing standards should be a minimum. The market itself should set the kind of expectation. Yeah,
Definitely. And then just off the back of that as well, another talked about topic is lifetime deposits. We covered this with the DPS managing director of how they're working closely of potentially bringing this into play. I'd be interested to hear from yourself of how you see this working moving forward if it was to come into place, and if there's anything that's being shared that maybe you can share with the listeners.
Yeah, I mean, it's not an area that I'm necessarily expert in, and I'm sure DPS have a far better idea. Certainly for tenants, it can be a real challenge, can't it? If you've got the best part of £1,000 tied up in one deposit, to then find another deposit for your house move, that can be a real challenge. But at the same time, you need the processes. What happens when there are dilapidations or a tenant's got rent arrears? What happens in those situations that's going to protect both the current landlord and also the future landlord? I would want more reassurance as to the practicalities of that. I think in principle it's a really good idea, but the practicalities need to be very clear so that no landlord is being penalised and tenants can't, there's no loophole that will see those landlords at a loss because of how the system works.
I think that was my biggest concern is, like you said, if there's dilapidations on one property going into a next one, how do you work out that, especially if the damage supersedes the deposit that was there? What protection does that landlord have? So just to see what happens on that, because that was one of the things mentioned as well that's coming up quite frequently that a lot of people are pushing for. Yeah,
I mean, it's making renting accessible, isn't it, to all sorts of people, but at the same time it has to be done properly and effectively so that everybody has is protected. Yeah, tenants and landlords. It's a balance, always a balance.
Perfect. And then going on to the boiler scheme that's been released, can you share some more information on this?
So this is a really new announcement as well, isn't it? The new requirements for EPCs has obviously been pending for a while now, with private rented sector properties going to be required to have a C rating is the latest proposals, isn't it? So landlords would be really prudent to get on board as soon as possible. We jumped through the hoops for the EICRs, and a lot of people found it stressful towards the end when the deadlines were looming and contractors were busy, and the cost could be into thousands. And again, we've got the situation now again with new EPCs. So the government's announced the government upgrade boiler scheme. It's now open for properties in England and Wales. You can get £5,000 grant for air source heat pumps, £6,000 grant for ground source, and a £5,000 for biomass if you're in a rural area. So obviously they're not insignificant amounts of money, and they are open for landlords and second property owners. So that's great news. One of the interesting caveats though is that you have to have fulfilled any insulation requirements on your current EPC. So if there's anything there outstanding, that has to be addressed before you can access these grants. So it's really in the interest of the landlord to have a look at your current EPCs, have a look and see what the requirements and recommendations are. Make sure that you start with that insulation, and then have a look at the scheme and make those applications proactively. You're going to be, it's better for your tenants, because in the current cost of living crisis that we're in, it helps them reduce their energy bills. So it builds a better relationship between you and them. It takes that pressure off, even though we're not 100% certain what the EPC regulations will quite look like. At least acting proactively puts you in a strong position. So yeah, I would recommend to landlords they have a look at that boiler scheme as well.
Do you think it's likely to be a C? Obviously, all the speculation is saying C and above. When we spoke last time with Megan, Isla were trying to push for a D, but how far they got with that, whether it's sort of progressing to that, because the amount someone has to spend to bring it up to the standard, with the average rate being a D or below on properties, is quite a substantial spend on that. So
it can be, yeah, thousands and thousands of pounds, can't it? And that obviously impacts landlords' yields and profits. And there's another reason, that landlords think, well, actually, I don't want to jump through this next set of hoops. I'll withdraw. But it's in the hands of the government, and it's still going through processes at the moment. It's still being proposed as a C. But I think if landlords are really concerned about it, the best thing to do, as well as looking at what's on offer to them, is to get involved with their local MPs or get in touch with Propertymark and say, look, this is the situation, so that lobbying can potentially make a difference going forward and make it more realistic, or make the offers more accessible for people, so that we don't see those landlords withdraw. Because I mean, as again, like Megan said, it affects nearly 50% of properties currently within the private rented sector. That's a huge number, yeah. So who knows? But at the moment, I mean, it probably in these circumstances best to go with worst case scenario and go with the C rating and see what can help you get up there, but at the same time take those steps to lobby for something more suitable.
What are Propertymark's theories on these, I'll call them schemes from the government to fund things, where a really high amount is banded around by Richie Sunak? We're putting 30 million into this, we're putting 100 million into that. And as an agent, the Green Deal rings a bell with me about something that was trumpeted, and I have never met a single person who claimed any money out of the Green Deal, because
No.
all it was going to do was cause them time, aggravation, and cost their tenants money.
Well, yeah, exactly. And then plus, I think with the Green Deal, a lot of the things on offer actually weren't suitable for the properties that were needing them. So I had various landlords that looked at them and went, actually doesn't suit my property. Love to make use of it, but I can't. So exactly. That's why we need to have that conversation with government and make them aware that it's not a one size fits all solution, that there has to be nuances and options, and actually has to be fit for purpose. It's no good just shouting sort of in an echo chamber. We have to actually use the proper channels so that the proper people who have that influence, who have that sway, get to hear our voices.
I think one of the things that I've been encouraging anyone that's been looking at properties, or anyone that's got a property that's a D rating or below, is to start looking at improving those performance of the property now.
Yes.
And the reason I say that is come 2025, when it does come into effect, I know it's not confirmed yet, but it pretty much is.
Mm-hmm.
When everyone decides to do it at the same time, all those contractors are going to be inundated with work. And what happens when you've got a lot of demand? Prices go up.
Yeah,
the cost of loft insulation is going to go through the roof. You heard it here first.
Exactly. So get in early and get the work done before it does cost you substantially more than what it will cost now. I know it's going to cost a bit, but with interest rates as low as they are, look at maybe financing and taking some money out and starting the works, because the likelihood it's going to happen. If you're looking for a new investment, look for either a new build or something that's already within that category.
Yeah, definitely. For new investors that are looking for a C-rated property, even if it costs more, I mean, it just saves so much time and money and effort, and tenants don't always want the intrusion of retrofitting properties. So yeah, look for the C ratings is absolutely key. And then if you have got a property, whether that's something that you've inherited it, or it's an older investment, then yeah, absolutely, I agree with you to start now. I mean, we saw it with the ICRs that demand on electricians was just through the roof, and people really struggled if they left it too late to hit those deadlines. We need to abide by the lessons we learned there and start sooner so that you've got time in hand. Definitely. I mean, contractors are hard enough to get hold of as they are at the minute.
As Mike said, you heard it here first, so get your EPCs done early. It brings me on to my last question. Was we're seeing lots obviously about the cost of living increasing. You can't miss it. We all see it. Petrol prices at a ridiculous price on a daily basis. But what does this mean for tenants with arrears and anyone that's potentially going to fall within that category that are on lower incomes? What advice can you give to landlords out there that's maybe potentially experiencing this now with their tenants, or could potentially experience it?
Yeah, I think, I mean, whether it's now or whether it's potentially in the future, things are biting hard, and landlords do need to be mindful of the situations that tenants are experiencing. So to have those conversations, to build your relationship with your tenants right from the off is so important, isn't it? And we've been, one of the good things to come out of COVID and lockdowns has been that a lot of landlords have built those relationships up. They've kind of negotiated their way through some tricky situations and got to know their tenants as people, rather than just the people that live in their house. Do you know what I mean? There's a human side to it, and a lot of landlords took that on board during COVID, and it's the same again now, really. The prices keep increasing, people's wages aren't in line, so there are going to be situations where tenants are likely to struggle. I guess one of the things that landlords can do, is to, I mean, the bonus of if you're sorting out your EPCs and making your properties more energy efficient, then you're helping your landlords straight off the bat there with what is a big concern for a lot of people right now with their energy bills. But if tenants do have issues with their rent, I think being open to them coming to you is the first best thing that you can possibly do, because it's when tenants go underground and suddenly go off radar, that's when things get really a bit scary, a bit nerve-wracking, and can escalate to unmanageable proportions. But if a tenant's going, well, actually I am struggling, can I have a conversation about that, it gives you more options, more time to sort something out and sort of come to some agreement. And the thing is as well, the market keeps increasing, doesn't it? But there will become a point where that's not sustainable. So I think, even though in terms of investment, obviously you want to get the best possible rent that you can, it's also morally, I think, prudent to have a look at your tenant circumstances if you're requesting rent increases or putting your property on the market, as to what is actually affordable for the local market, what's actually affordable for your tenants, and to balance that as well with what you need to make as a landlord, for yourself as well, because keeping tenants in a property and being in the circumstances where they can manage their rent causes so fewer issues than if you've got a tenant who can't pay. They end up with thousands of pounds of arrears. You have to go through the process of evicting them, then potentially having a void period whilst you sort all of that out and get the property back on the market. So look for the long term rather than short term, and just be human and kind, and signpost to kind of ways to help without being patronizing, and just be human.
No, I agree. I think that question wasn't to scare any landlords out there, by the way. That was specifically for anyone that's fallen into the unfortunate circumstance of maybe redundancy, or they're ill. These things happen, unfortunately. And as we had with a reference company recently, is references are only a snapshot of today. It doesn't mean tomorrow something won't happen. So it doesn't happen every day, but we are seeing the increased cost of living going up, and it is something that potentially you may witness over the years. So it's something just to prepare for.
I think so. I mean, when I was an agent, I was predominantly responsible for rent payments and rent arrears, and although we had blips over the start of lockdown, it was surprising how much tenants prioritised their rent payments. They had a respect for their landlords, and the vast majority will always put that as a priority for their expenditure. They really rely on having a roof over their heads, so that is one of their priority spends. Perhaps one of the things that helps, actually, and I'd always suggest, is to make sure that your tenant's rent due date aligns with the day that they get paid, or the day that their income comes in, so that there's no chance for it to dissipate in other ways. It just automatically goes out. Get them to set up that standing order in line. You can adjust, can't you, on a daily rent calculation, and that again really helps sort of negate those worries about that rent not coming in.
I have to agree. Now, before I pass you over to Mike to go for the quick fire questions, other than the renters reform bill, is there anything in the near future that landlords need to be aware of that may be coming into effect?
I think with the EPCs and the renters reform, I think they're the two kind of big areas that landlords really should be looking at, and just having those conversations and talking to the right channels and really getting to grips with, because 9 times out of 10 you can actually be pretty reassured that even though they're going to be big changes. They don't need to be devastating changes, and there's still a good investment to be had within the private rented sector for being a landlord, especially when the demand is going to continue. You know, you're unlikely to be at a loss if you've got a house of a decent standard to not be able to find a reliable tenant for your property. And even though the R word of recession keeps being touted, if you're in it for the long run, even if there is a blip in the market, long term, you're always going to make money on property. So having it rented out gives you that time to see that investment come through, regardless of what the short-term pain points might be.
Mike, you've got a great example for when you witnessed the last recession. How long did it last for, in your eyes?
In leafy Berkshire, 1 month. 2008 recession lasted a month. House prices dived. Everyone took their house off the market because they're all knee deep in equity, and house prices recovered overnight. Absolutely non-event where we're based, which my family's from the northeast, and it took 15 years probably to recover to previous highs. So I've got a good understanding of it's not just all about us. But yeah, southeast, incredible situation in 2008. That houses just disappeared off the market overnight, and because, as you've mentioned 2 or 3 times, demand and supply just takes over. If there's nothing available and someone wants something, they're gonna have to pay for it. So anything can happen in a downturn, really. That's it, just like we've had anything happen in the last 2 years. No one would have predicted the situation we're in now.
No, absolutely. And, you know, there's a lot of doom mongering, isn't there? And there's, again, in the sales market, a lot of uncertainty. And it's, if you're in sales, that's the question that everybody's on the lips. You know, is there going to be a recession? Is my house going to be worth it? Is it worth buying now? But ultimately, if you're buying it for the right reasons and for a long term, then there's nothing really to worry about, is there, overall? So, nobody's house is certainly worth less than it was worth at the time of the last recession. So yeah, there's always look for the brighter side of that rather than the doom laden side.
Yeah, I totally agree. Anyone buying a property for a 6 month quick buck, you should never be buying a property for a 6 month quick buck. I see why people do it. But as you said, the key is that on average, a house price will double every 10 to 15 years. And there will be blips within that 10 or 15 year period. So if it comes in the first 2, then you've pretty much got it written into a guarantee that the next 13 is going to be pretty good for you. So, and the house is only ever worth what it's worth when you actually cash out of it. So
yeah, absolutely.
To see values going up and down when you've got a tenant in situ really is a bit of an irrelevance, really. But to the quick fire round, I'm taking it off Tristan this week. We've switched roles. I don't know if you've watched or listened to us before, but taking off your Propertymark hat and putting all your professionalism aside for a totally personal opinion, what happens next in the housing market?
Wow, well, people always need houses, won't they? I would say at the end of the day, no matter what happens with Bank of England or interest rates or whatever, at the end of the day, people need somewhere to live. So what shape that takes or what interventions there are, the only priority that any one person really should be focusing on is what their needs are and how they meet their needs.
And if you were to invest in a property deal, be that anything in property, what would be the perfect investment for you?
It shouldn't ever be about the money or about the figure. It should be about what it provides in terms of your happiness. So if it's your family home, like you say, until it comes to the point that you want to sell it, it doesn't matter what it's worth. I've lived in my own house since I was 15 and it's my home, and I don't really care what it's worth. I know it's worth more than what I bought it for off my mum's estate when she died, but it's irrelevant. So the perfect property purchase would be a property that I loved rather than one that I thought, oh, that could make me some money. Because if you look after the first and you do it for the right reasons, the second actually follows.
Absolutely. I think we've got an interesting example of a property we've just listed for sale with Lee Glomay today, where it was a lady's own property. She loved it. It was rented out privately, interestingly enough. It took her a year to get the tenants out.
Wow.
And rather than just stick the house on the market with its damp, its mold, its mildew, its ruined carpets, she's put some money back into it, come back to the property, loved it again, and potentially the investment that she's put in will be quadrupled.
Wow.
On the refurbishment in sales value. So, like you say, putting some love into a property, some emotion, some time is a massive thing, because it reflects in other people.
Yeah, treat a property like you would want it to be treated if it was yours, whether you're either selling it or whether you're renting it out. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, absolutely. And one question that's not normally on the list, but a big one for a Propertymark representative: pets in lets with pets, whichever way round you want to put it. As a landlord, pets yay or pets nay?
I don't think a cat or a dog is the worst thing that could possibly happen to a property. Your tenants are more likely to be grateful, more respectful, and they tend to stay longer as well. So, there are definitely benefits to allowing pets rather than saying no.
Right. Well, thanks very much for your time, Natalie.
You're welcome. It's been fun
to have you on the show and sort of share a different opinion and give us an update of what's going on there. So yeah, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. It's been really good. Thanks very much.
So Mike, that's a wrap. So there's a lot of information shared there that's been talked about for a while. And I think from my view, was interesting to see what's going on with the Renters Reform Bill. As I mentioned at the start, I wanted to hear from her mouth of where we stand with things. And I think evictions are important, but I think it's fair to say what she said is people like to know why they're being evicted. Although we don't see it day to day with no reason, it'll be interesting to see when it comes into place how much they strengthen up the Section 8 notice to get their properties back. But I think everyone's entitled to their view on it. Personally, I don't agree with it, but I think what she shared there really got to me. On top of the EPC changes, it's still not confirmed as a C, and there is a possibility they're pushing for a D. So it'd be interesting to see what happens with that as well. But what did you take away from this today?
Yeah, I think I'm in agreement with you. D would be a much more sensible figure. I used to own and rent out an apartment which was built in 2008. That was ranked as a D. I lived in that flat, and I can tell you it was perfectly efficient and fit for use. And upgrading it to a C would be a massive challenge, given there was no gas in the street. To be quite frank, at this point in time, I've got no interest in putting a heat pump into a property. But yeah, I agree with you again from the Section 21 point of view. I think the only reason people are worried is because they don't know what's going to replace it. And I totally agree with that sentiment. But I also agree with Natalie's point of view that it's almost a misuse of Section 21, because it's called a no-fault eviction. So people just serve the Section 21, don't give anyone any explanations about why it's being done. So the tenant automatically feels hard done by. Whereas as a career professional, I've always provided a cover letter or a phone call before the notice has gone out to have a chat with the tenant, explain the situation so they know there's a human reason behind why they're receiving a notice, which to a lot of people just looks like legal jargon. So it could have been something that the industry could have regulated itself properly in the first place to prevent this situation manifesting itself, really.
I have to agree with that. And I think like we said in the podcast, it's all about building relationships. If you have a good relationship with your tenant from the start, it's so much easier to make that call to them and say, look, really sorry, change of circumstances, this has happened, rather than, like you're saying, getting that shock, opening the letter and finding the notice. It's obviously not nice to see, but it's just so important to have that relationship, and it could have been broken down earlier. I have to agree with that. So that's an end of this week's podcast. We hope you found it useful. If you have any question at all, or you feel that you'll be a good guest for the show that could benefit the listeners out there, feel free to send us a DM at the Landlord Page, or get in contact via the website. But we thank you very much for your time. Until next week, Mike.
Till next week, see you then.
I'm flicking through YouTube and through Spotify. I don't think there's a podcast or a video channel on YouTube that landlords could land on where they're not being sold something.
I mean, it'd be the first time any estate agents ever asked that question, but why not ask that question to a wider audience?
Estate agents have the knowledge there, but they don't seem to share it.
You can do different episodes based around someone that wants an exit plan or someone that's just starting their portfolio.
The rules change every year.
Yeah.
But why not just open the floor out and just say, well, is property even the best investment out there?
And tax advice is a big thing, especially with everything that's changed, capital gains tax, and obviously your stamp duty costs that you need to pay and whatnot. People don't realise what they need to prepare for.
We build a podcast and we build a YouTube channel, somewhere that landlords can go and they feel they're not being sold to, but they're just getting quality advice.